In this video, I'll show you how I paint black armour. It's a nice neutral black, which means it's neither warm nor cold. It's my favourite kind of black as it goes well with pretty much any other colour. I'll be using an airbrush for some parts, but if you don't have one, you can just skip those bits out and it'll still look great. So to prime the model, I use Vallejo Black Surface Primer. I'm going to apply this with an airbrush for a nice smooth finish. However, if you don't have an airbrush, any rattle can black primer is totally fine. Next, we're going to base coat the model using Games Workshop's Abaddon Black. Again, I'm going to use an airbrush to apply this, but if you don't have one, you can just use a brush. Just make sure to apply it in multiple thin coats just to maintain that smoothness. So I'm mixing the Abaddon Black about 50-50 with airbrush thinner. I also like to add 1 drop of Vallejo Flow Improver, just to try and minimise the chance of the airbrush clogging. This step does really require an airbrush, however if you don't have one, just go straight to step 3. So what I'm showing you here is what we're really aiming for in this step. Just some nice soft volume highlights on each of the raised prominent parts of the model. When I say volume highlights, I'm basically talking about the large soft highlights as opposed to sharp, thinner edge highlights. So I'm starting with Games Workshop's Mechanicus Standard Grey, and I'm mixing about 5 drops of this to around 5 drops of airbrush thinner, with 1 drop of Flow Improver as well. Now what I'm doing is carefully picking out the most prominent parts of the model that I think light would hit the most. So try and avoid those recesses and focus on the raised prominent sections. So I'll take you through each part of the model that I'll be focusing on, and that's going to be the knee pads, the tops of the boots, tops of the thighs, top of the chest plate, tops of the shoulder pads, the little ball things on the ankles, backs of the boots, tops of the calves on the back of the legs, the little bum flap thing, and any other prominent raised feature. Try not to go too wild with this stage, otherwise you'll find the model will start to look grey instead of black. And I know I'm kind of speeding through this just for the video, but I really take my time on each part, making sure each highlight is soft and gradual. You'll notice that I'm always angling my airbrush downwards. It's just to try and simulate that it's light hitting the model from above. Just be patient and try to gradually build up these soft patches of light. So once you're finished with this stage, you should have something looking a bit like this. Next, we're basically going to do the same thing again, but with a slightly lighter grey, Games Workshop's Dawnstone. Again, mix it about 50-50 with airbrush thinner and 1 drop of Flow Improver. This time though, we're going to go even softer, just sticking to the very tops of the most prominent features and trying not to completely cover the Mechanicus grey we applied earlier. If you think you've gone a bit overboard with the grey in places, you can just go back in with some Abaddon Black, like I'm doing here, and knock back those areas. Remember, it's important that the model stays mostly black. And with that, the volume highlights are finished. It should look a bit like this. So for the first edge highlights, I'm using a 50-50 mix of Abaddon Black and Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm calling this a chunky edge highlight as it's just a nice thick line that the lighter and thinner highlights we'll do a bit later can sit neatly inside. You're aiming for something around 0.5 millimeter in width, but it can be bigger if you want. You really don't have to be overly neat with this stage as it's just so subtle. It's also worth noting that you can make the paint fairly thin at this stage as it will help with the subtlety and also means that you won't have to refill your brush so much. You'll notice that as well as the edges, I'm also painting along the inside of some recesses, like the leg section just above the boot here. You don't have to do this, I just think it can add to the overall contrast of the model. If you decide to do it, it's important to remember not to paint right up to the recess, but to leave a very small gap, as it's important for our recesses to remain black. So once this stage is finished, you should have something looking like this. Everything is still nice and subtle at this point. Next up, we're going to be using Games Workshop's Dawnstone, and this is going to be our first proper thin edge highlight. You're aiming to get these nice and thin, but still clear and defined. And remember, we're trying to keep these lines inside our previous chunky highlights. And you'll want to thin your paint slightly for this so it comes off the brush nicely, but not quite as thin as the previous step. You'll soon notice how hard it is to keep your brush steady whilst doing this. Something which can help is bracing your brush hand against the hand that's holding the model. Personally, I like to rest both my elbows on the table and have my hands in the air bracing against each other, as I found this position to be good for my back, but I know some people prefer to have their hands down leaning against the table. Another really important thing is to hold the model in such a way as to make it as easy as possible to keep the lines straight. For me, this is a position where I can pull the brush directly towards myself or pulling it left to right. If I try and push the brush away from me or push it right to left, I just can't get the line straight. So you'll need to keep adjusting the angle you're holding the model with pretty much every edge highlight you do. As well as using the tip of the brush, you'll see that sometimes I use the side of the brush too. This can speed up the edge highlighting process, but I'd only recommend doing it on edges which are nice and sharp. You also don't want too much paint on your brush when you're doing this. I think it's important at this point for me to mention mistakes, and the fact that you'll make plenty of them when trying to paint neat. I made tons of mistakes whilst painting this model, and generally my approach is just to go back and fix them with your previous highlight or base colours. I like to do this as soon as I make a mistake, otherwise I tend to forget about them, and annoyingly I'll usually end up noticing them in a photograph when it's sort of too late to do anything about. I actually kind of wish I'd included some mistakes in this video, and I'll try and include some in the next one. And once you finish this stage, it should look a bit like this. For the second edge highlight, we're going to be using Games Workshop's Administratum Grey, and again slightly thinned but not too much. If you're wanting to move a bit faster, you can always skip this step. I just feel it adds a lot of contrast to the model, which can help it stand out, but it'll look nice without it too. Now this is a very light grey, so we don't want to be using too much of it. What we're aiming for here is basically to copy our previous highlight, but instead of painting the entire length of each line like we did before, this time we're only going to go over the most raised bits, just sticking to the most upwards facing edges where you think you'd see the most light. If you're wondering what I'm using as my painting handle here, it's actually just a large cork. I went to a local wine shop and asked if they had any I could have, and I came home with a box full. I then stick a piece of straightened paperclip into the cork, drill a 1mm wide hole into the bottom of the model's foot, and superglue the wire into that hole. I prefer this to attaching the model to its base straight away, as it makes it easier to get to certain parts of the legs. If you find that the cork is a bit wobbly when you stand it on your desk, you can always superglue a Games Workshop base to the bottom of it. I find that this helps it to stand nice and steady. So here's how we're looking after the second edge highlight. It's looking pretty cool, but there's one more little step we can do to really make it stand out. So for this final step, we're going to be using Games Workshop's Corax White. And again, you're going to want to thin it slightly just to help it off the brush. Now if you're going to skip either this step or the previous one, I'd skip the previous one. There's something about adding dot highlights which makes Armour look so cool, and honestly I find this step really quick and relatively easy compared to edge highlighting. So what we're doing here is just applying a tiny dot to either the very centre of our previous highlights or to a corner where two edge highlights meet. Basically this is the apex of where light is hitting, so just try and place it where you think each edge highlight would shine the most. A few people have asked me why I wear a glove when I paint. I tend to wear a glove just on the hand I'm using to hold the miniature, just to try and minimise any dust, dirt or grease from your skin transferring to the model. It might seem like a bit of an unnecessary thing to do, but if you really care about the clean finish of a model at the end of a paint job, then I'd thoroughly recommend trying it out. One last thing to add, it might look like I'm painting really fast, but I've just sped up some parts of the footage. I'm actually quite a slow painter, so just take your time getting it neat, there's no need to rush. By the way, if you're wondering what chapter this Space Marine is, it's actually a white scar. A bit weird for a Black Armour tutorial, I know, but it's a commission I'm doing as part of a White Scars army where some of the more sneaky units are actually painted in black. So yeah, a little bit weird for a black tutorial, but it's a white scar. And so with the dot highlights finished, that's the Black Armour done. And here it is, the finished model. Now obviously there's a few bits I've added to the model, like the white parts, the metallics, some leather, but apart from that, this is exactly how I painted the Black Armour. It might seem like quite a time-consuming process, and I guess it is, but if you want a particular squad or a character to look nice, then it's kind of worth putting in a bit of extra effort. Or alternatively, if you wanted to speed things up, you can always cut out some of the steps. If you do try this method, please let me know how you get on, and good luck. I'll see you in the next video.